get a complex. Tonight we're wrapping up the primeval history of the world. In fact, as we get toward the end of chapter 11, we'll actually touch a little bit on Abraham and the descendants of Terah for a little bit, just to kind of give an introduction to what really begins the patriarchal age. It's been patriarchal age up to this point, but now we start to get into the true patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But we're going to wrap up tonight with the Tower of Babel. And it's one of those, again, you know, so many of these stories, and I've mentioned this before, so many of these stories that we talk about are things we learned when we were in grade school, when we were in Bible classes with the little kids, and we, you learn about the flood, and you learn about creation, and you learn about the Tower of Babel. And they're just kind of those elementary stories. And I'll tell you, it's been a blessing for me to kind of get to dig further into those beyond what I learned in grade school or as a little kid, where you wanted to learn about the Tower of Babel and then you wanted to play with Play-Doh. I don't have any Play-Doh tonight, so we're going to learn about the Tower of Babel. You'll have to give me a little leeway tonight. This is the last class, so I thought I would use a secular reference. But in fact, that's what this is. The Tower of Babel is a failure to communicate. And it's caused by God for his purposes, because once again, man has determined that he knows better. And God steps in and says, no, you don't. I want to walk through chapter 10 real quick. Chapter 10, for the most part, is genealogy. And we've not delved into genealogy throughout this class because, frankly, it's just difficult. Like some of the genealogy we've touched on earlier, the genealogy in chapter 10 is probably, I hate to use the word an incomplete genealogy, but it's not generation to generation to generation. It's a summarized genealogy, if you will. And so instead of having the born, begot, where it's each son, it's likely the more important names. And one of the reasons we know we kind of suspect this is because it covers 70 generations, exactly 70. And so it's kind of that definition of completeness, and it kind of filters down. So, for instance, and we'll just talk about this right now, Japheth. Japheth was probably the oldest son of Noah, from what we're able to gather. And it talks about from the coastline, for Japheth, it only covers 3 generations. Of all the generations that it covers in chapter 10, it only covers 3 for Japheth. We suspect that this is probably because Japheth and his generations have fairly little interaction with Shem and his generations following. So if you look throughout Scripture, Shem has a number of the descendants of Shem had a number of interactions with the descendants of Ham, where, the Philistines, the Amorites, a lot of those that you hear about throughout Scripture, but you have very little interaction between the descendants of Shem and the descendants of Japheth. Again, we believe Japheth is the oldest. When I learned them, I don't know about you guys, but when I learned the sons of Noah, it was always Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So you kind of always assume that it's oldest to youngest, right? Well, that's not the case. Ham was the youngest. We learned this later on previously in chapter 9, verse 24, where it talks about, and it's a story we didn't talk about with the sin of Noah, but it basically says that he realized what his youngest son or his younger son had done to him. But Ham was the younger son. We believe that Shem is probably the middle child, and we gather this if you'll look at verse 10:21. Verse 10:21, the children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. And so we believe that Japheth is the older son. Now, there will be some versions of Scripture that will translate that differently. And it will say something to the effect of Shem, the older brother of Japheth. And so, but from what we're able to gather, Japheth is probably the older, and then Shem would be the second son. What I wanted to point out with this slide in particular, besides discussing who was the oldest, but I want you to take note of the three verses that I've got up there. Verse 10:5, and it's kind of wrapping up Japheth's generations. And it says, from these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. So wait a minute, everyone according to their language. Well, what was the language? Because the story of the Tower of Babel doesn't happen until the next chapter. So it's probably here that he's going on beyond the Tower of Babel, and the separation occurs after chapter 11, but the genealogy that he's talking about goes through chapter 11. So from a time frame perspective, he's saying eventually, once we get past chapter 11, these nations will all be divided based on their language and where they settle. He said the same thing with Ham. In verse 10:20, these were the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands and in their nations. And then, of course, the same thing with Shem. We believe that the reference to the Tower of Babel in chapter 10 is in verse 10:25. To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. We believe this is when the culmination of the story of the Tower of Babel occurred, and the people were scattered abroad as God had intended. And then finally, these were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations in their nations. And from these the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. Any thoughts that you have before we move on? Chapter 11 starts out, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And so after the flood, the descendants of Noah journeyed from the east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Have you guys heard of the land or the plain of Shinar before? Anybody? Shinar. Does that ring a bell to anybody? What great city is in the land of Shinar, in the plain of Shinar? Babylon. Isn't it interesting? Tower of Babel, Babylon. And you actually can make that correlation. It's probably the same place that we're talking about. So they are in the plain of Shinar. Eventually Babylon gets built, but it starts out as Babel. In fact, if you read here in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And of course, he carried it all back to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, which would have been in Babylon. I just thought that was an interesting aside. As close as those are as names, I don't know that I'd ever made that connection. But apparently there's a pretty good connection there between what started out as Babel and the eventual city of Babylon. It may be hundreds of years later, but there's a pretty good connection there. Now we get into the story. This is the part that we learned in grade school. Man had a very simple plan. Man's plan was, and they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." In chapter 3, it says, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." So man's plan was fairly simple. They're going to make bricks. They're going to bake them because that makes them harder than setting them out in the sun to dry. They're going to build a tower and a city. All right, pop quiz. What's wrong with this plan? You got it right off the bat, Ed. Of course. There is absolutely nothing wrong with them building a city. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them building a tower other than the motives behind it. There's nothing wrong with them making bricks. But apparently in this process, they forgot about God. You know, somebody turn to James 4:13 through 16. Somebody read that for me. James 4:13 through 16. And now you boast in your arrogance. And so what was one of the purposes for the descendants of Noah building a tower? Make a name for ourselves. Right? Make a name for ourselves. So they did not consider God in their plans because their plans were all about who? Themselves. It's all about themselves. Charles? And we're going to get to that because that's another, in the next slide, that's another thing that is an issue with this whole, it goes directly against one of God's commands, right? We'll talk about that. Proverbs 19:21 says, "Many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand." And that's what the descendants of Noah in this instance had forgotten. They had come to a place, they had decided that they would take the reins, that they would make a name for themselves, and they forgot the counsel of God.
Do you have any idea, Mark, what the period of time had been after the flood, before this?
We do not. Again, the genealogies we feel like are kind of a summary genealogy, so it's even difficult to track it from a time frame as far as genealogies. We know it was during the time of, or at least we surmise from Scripture that it's during the time of Peleg, a son of Eber. But how far down the genealogy that is, we really just don't know. And what's more interesting, if you think about this, and it was pointed out in one of the things I read, these will be all of the descendants of Noah. So one of the reasons you tend to build a tower, in fact, in the translations regarding the term for this tower, would suggest it is a watchtower or a defense tower of some sort. But if you're the entire population of the earth, you really don't need a watchtower, do you? So as we start to look into it, it becomes more and more evident that this is probably some type of temple or worship facility that they're looking at building. There was a discussion, or one of the historians talked about a tower in the area of Babel, and it was a step pyramid, similar to what we see, I guess, in the Mayan temples and stuff. But it was supposedly 200 to 300 feet tall, which, in our day and age, that's not huge, that's not outrageous. But to those at that time, that would have been pretty significant. And the history or tradition surrounding that particular tower was that the ruling entity at any time would go up to the top of that tower once a year and essentially shake hands with God. So there is some religious implication to this tower probably that is not outlined in Scripture. The fact that you want to build a tower to get to heaven, what does that imply to you? Your plan's smarter than God's. God may have had a plan to get to heaven, but I've got my own plan to get to heaven. We tend to have a situation now in this world, in this day and age, where do you guys know people that are building towers? Building towers up to heaven? Every single day we run across people that are building their own towers. Because they have a plan to get to heaven, and whether they know it or not, they're leaving God completely out of those plans, because they've made those plans, and that's me. And I am all-knowing, and I'm particularly intelligent, and so I've got a plan, and just like the people in the Tower of Babel, they leave God out of it. And they're going to come to the same conclusion. Thoughts that you have? So man's plan was to bake bricks, to build a city, to build a tower. We'll talk a little bit, and we just talked a little bit about this, man's intent. Because it's one thing to have plans, it's another thing to have intent. So your motivations are important. Man's intent, a tower whose top is in the heavens. What does that suggest? We just talked about what that suggests to you. An opportunity to get to God. I can get to God on my own. I can build this tower, we'll get to God on our own. A top in the heavens. We've talked about the other one. Let us make a name for ourselves. What does that suggest to you? Want to make a name for yourself? Do you know people today that want to make a name for themselves? Pride. Pride. What was one of the 3 sins that Satan tempted Eve with? Pride of life. And it's still the same things. It's still the exact same things that we deal with today. Let us make a name for ourselves. And then finally, we discuss the other one, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. Why is that a problem? Well, but what were they told? If you wanted to cheat, you'd look right over there in the other column. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Did God want them to stay all together? No, God didn't want them to stay all together. Be fruitful and multiply. And don't stay all together. Fill the earth. Spread out. I've made this entire earth, and you have no idea of the size and scale of where you're living. And if you want to stay on this one little plane, you're going to end up having problems eventually. Just from the standpoint, think about this, just from the standpoint of the tactical scenario, if you have that many people living in one plane, what are some of the problems they're going to run into? Run out of food. That's the main one I can think of. What else? Water. What else? You know, in my business, I have to think about sewer, right? Sorry, but think about the issues that you run into with having that many people in that one place, regardless of how big a tower or how big a city they build. And diseases, exactly. All of those types of things, all of the things that we recognize now, in fact, all of the issues that big cities today have. You go to Chicago, you don't see a lot of farmland in the city of Chicago. They have issues because they have to deal with the waste, you know, the garbage trucks and the sewage facilities and all of that has to be taken care of. But you think about it from the standpoint that, did these people really think this through? It's one thing when you're traveling, and they were moving to the east, remember? Said that in Scripture. And you can kind of live on the land there, but once you settle, then all of these logistics come into play regarding food and water and all of the other things, places to live. Skip over to the other column. Let's talk about intent, God's intent. It's interesting. They said, we're going to build a tower whose top is in the heavens, and we're going to get up to see God. Well, when it talks about God, what does God have to do? It says God came down to see their tower. There's probably a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek scenario here. Yes, we built a tower to reach to the heavens, but God has to come down to see the tower. Did God have to come down? Did God have to go anywhere to see their tower? So it's likely that what's at play here is a little bit of a word play to say, God saw their tower. He came down to look at your little tower. Something along those lines. There's another one that I struggle with where it says, let us make a name for ourselves. And I'll tell you, because what they said was, God said, now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible to them. I always struggle a little bit with this scripture or this passage. What does that imply to you guys? I know, because I've said that I struggle with it. You guys are afraid to answer because you probably have the same.
Will do a lot of things.
They have the ability to do a lot of things. They are all working together. What he said was, now that they are all working together, they can accomplish a great deal of things. I used to think in terms of, well, you know, is God holding man back here? Is he saying that, well, we don't want man to advance and do great things? That's not what he's saying, is it? I think of it in terms of, you know, I use this analogy quite regularly around children. Many of you have had children. And you ever have the situation where a child does something and it's just, you know, it's a little over the top, maybe a little bit dangerous? And once they've accomplished that and they lived through it, then the question becomes, oh no, what are they going to do next? Well, that's kind of the sentiment that's being reflected here. If I allow them to do this and they are successful, then what is their next thing? Where are they going to go from here? Here.
Because they just made a mess of it.
That's right. And that's exactly the point, is they had kind of we've been down this road before, where they kind of did their own thing. And as we have learned, you know, God said, the thought or intent of man's heart is evil continually from his youth. So the question here is, what is the next thing? If I let them go through with this, where do they go from here? If we let them build a tower that has some type of religious significance to them, where do we go from here and what's next? So this is not, oh, man will become so powerful that we can't stop him. This is, man will continue on to his own destruction because he thinks he's doing great things.
Just thinking also, another thought along these lines is if they were relying upon something physical, the tower, to keep them united, and as a substitute for their spiritual being united. So the same thing can happen to people of all time.
That's exactly right. They rely on, to your point, a physical thing. What did Jeroboam do once the kingdom was divided? Who remembers? He sure did. He built a new temple. Why was that? Didn't want them going to Jerusalem. So he substitutes, I guess, a different worship for the worship that was in place to accomplish a physical issue or a physical problem. So he's overcome a physical problem by building a physical plant to overcome what was a spiritual issue at that time. Yes?
Satan do the exact same thing in the Garden of Eden with Eve when he first of all asked Eve, what did God say? So now she cannot say, I did not know.
That's right.
Because he told her. And then he said, nah, that ain't
Yeah.
gonna happen.
Yeah.
So this is the same thing of saying, God said, go multiply and fill the earth. No. You can do this and make a name for yourself. It doesn't matter what God said.
We can all stay together. We all have it's wonderful to be united. And I preach unity from this pulpit, not this pulpit, that one up there. But I'll preach unity from the pulpit all day long because I think we need to be united. And as Christians, we need to be united. We need to have unity. We don't need to let the world divide us. But you know what? When we start coming up with worldly things to unite us, that becomes a problem. Because we already have a uniting factor, and it's not physical, it's spiritual. I talked about it this morning. That is the thing that unites us as Christians. And when we get beyond that, then we're sinning against God.
About where the world would be if God had made the decision at the time of that, okay, you all are not going to be able to achieve any greatness from this point on. This congregation wouldn't be here.
Oh, no.
I mean, you think about it getting down to very simple terms. That would prevent us, any of us, having the ambition to want to reach out to do anything.
That's right. But God didn't say you're not able to accomplish. And man, I mean, look at it. Man has accomplished great things already. Well, great things, at least in our eyes. I mean, as far as we're concerned, we've accomplished great things. But at this point in time, as a parent, God foresaw the future. He saw what was coming down the road. Just like many times you guys do as parents. You know, it's what my mom used to say, I have eyes in the back of my head. And it's not because she had eyes in the back of her head, but she knew what I was thinking. And that's what happens with God here. God knew what they were thinking. He knew that there was going to be long-term problems and implications because of this. And so he had to kind of break this up. Other thoughts that you have? Bill?
It also means that during this particular period of time, people were living 400, 500, 600 years lifetime. So if they go astray, they're going to be astray for a long time.
And one of the commentaries I read said exactly that, with the length of time that people were living and the issues they were moving down a similar path to what the people of the prior to the flood were. They were living long lives. They had a longer time to devise evil or other plans. I mean, if you look from Scripture, Abraham served other gods. It tells us in Scripture that Abraham served other gods before he was called by God. We'll get into that. Well, we won't tonight, but we can. So there's a good possibility that they were already down the path of serving other gods at this point in time. Yes, sir.
Interesting that they did make a name for themselves, but not the name.
And that tends to be that tends to be what happens when we kind of move down that path away from God and start relying on our own devices. We eventually make a name for ourselves. It's a good thought. God's response. Come, let us go down there, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. You know, I think from the passages we read back in 10 that this is physical language, this was actual language. But, you know, you can run into, even for people that speak the same language, we run into problems. I have often taught class where I've had people looking at me like, huh? Some of you are doing that right now. Even in people that speak the same language, there are misunderstandings or miscommunications or even differences of opinion and differences of, you know, can you imagine trying to build this huge tower, and if you've got a bunch of people, depending on your family, and you're the leader of the family, maybe you disagree with how that's built. Well, I think we ought to paint it gray. No, let's paint it brown. We have disagreements within families. Trying to accomplish a task of this size, whether you're speaking the same language or not, is a very difficult task. For those of you who have had any kind of architecture or building, even if it's just small things, you know that there's always a difference of opinion when you're building something. Probably because they started on this as a way to keep them all together, there were probably already some seeds of dissension amongst the group. There's probably already, they weren't all united to begin with, or they wouldn't have really needed to build a tower to keep them all together, right? So there's probably some challenges already amongst them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. So this is the part that we learn about in grade school, where, you know, once they could no longer understand each other, could no longer speak the same language, they could no longer coordinate their building plans, then everything just kind of fell apart. And again, we run into the same thing. We may all speak the same language, but if there's a differing viewpoint and a differing opinion and a different perspective, and we let it come into the church, then we end up with a denomination or another denomination. That's how it all came about. That's why we have some 60 or 70,000 different denominations in the world today. Because over time, man let their own thoughts, opinions, wants, needs creep into what God set forth in His Word. And as a result, we've been scattered abroad.
The question
dispersed across, for instance, the Alaskan Strait, how they were dispersed into different continents when they all started from that one area. But here's the answer to that, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the discussion about how they got to different places were, you know, well, how did they get all the way over to North America from the plain of Shinar? Well, I'll tell you, I don't know. They may have, it doesn't talk about, it says Nimrod was a mighty hunter. It doesn't say he was a great swimmer.
Capability of building boats.
That's right. That's right. And they had the capability, to your point, of building this big tower. So, yeah, getting to continent's probably not that big a deal. And it's likely that the geography of the world was significantly different at that point in time. We just don't know.
That's what I was going to say. How many continents were there before the flood? There may have only been one.
That's right.
I just say if you take all the continents and push them up together, they kind of fit together.
There's a little bit of a puzzle piece thing going on there. Yep.
So that should have been, it said he divided the earth.
Yep. It may have been a physical division as opposed to just a division of peoples and nations. Yeah. That's a possibility. I had thought of that as a possibility. I don't know how far down that path I would go, but you know, it's interesting that God said said to fill the whole earth. God easily could have accomplished that purpose however he wanted to. Did you have a? Oh, okay. All right. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Just an aside, its name is called Babel. Babel meant gate of God to the Babylonians. I don't know if that means a whole lot, but gate of God. Balal in Hebrew meant confused. And so it's likely that this comes about as kind of a play on words. And it means something to the effect of confused with the gate of God or something along those lines. So there was confusion. We know that much. All right, I've got I think one more slide. I told you that I would kind of wrap up chapter 11 and talk a little bit about Abram and Abraham, because this is the first mention we have. The rest of chapter 11, for the most part, finishes up the genealogy of Seth and gets us to Abram, eventually to become Abraham. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran. And by the way, the previous verse tells us that Haran had died. And his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son's Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. For those of you who remember this story, does this strike you as a little odd? What's a little off about this? Because what is the first thing we learn about Abraham or Abram? What did God tell Abraham? Go to chapter 12. See, we're leaking over into chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 1. Leave. It says, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. But Terah had already left his country and his land. He had already gone from the Ur of the Chaldeans. He was in Haran. So just aside, it appears that, or at least from what I read, Haran is about halfway between what would have been Ur of the Chaldeans and Canaan. So it appears that Terah got up, got his family, got halfway to Canaan, and then something happened that for some reason Terah did not move forward, did not go on. I don't know. Maybe he fell ill because then he died. And then God came to Abraham. and told Abraham to go on to the land of Canaan, or a land that he would show him. And that's it. Folks, we have covered 11 chapters of Genesis. Thoughts that you have?
They're given the genealogies, they're given exact, years of when people were born and how long, and you can easily track it. And if you look at it, Noah is most likely still alive when Abraham is born, or very, very close.
Yeah, yeah.
In the Bible,
Well, like I say, I think some of this is summary genealogy, but it is interesting. What I took from it is if you look before the flood and up to the time of Noah. So Noah lived to be 950 years old. If you start looking immediately after Noah, those lifespans are significantly less. They start dropping pretty heavily, down to around 600 years, down to around 400 years, till we get to Terah and we're down to around 200 years. And then Abraham, I think, lived to be, was it 140? 175? And then you get down to 140. Moses eventually is 120 and goes from there. So you start to see where God said, I will not strive with man forever. His days will be 120. You can take that as that's going to be lifespan as well, aside from he's got maybe 120 years left before the flood. So that's a couple of different directions to take that. Other thoughts you have? Folks, I have enjoyed this class immensely. I didn't know there was that much to learn in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And I will dare say that I have learned a whole lot more in preparing for this class than you guys have learned in me relating it. But I hope you will continue the study on your own, because it never ceases to amaze me. As I've mentioned before, these are stories that we hear as little kids. And sometimes we get ingrained in our mind how the story unfolds, and we think we know all about it. And certainly we know a lot about the physical aspects of the story, but we start relating it to other scripture and start figuring out that there's more to this story than just in these pages, because all of scripture interacts. All of scripture is tied together. And we come upon multiple scriptures that tie back to this original 11. That's all I have. Thank you very much.